A struggling mother and her kids walk into an upscale restaurant, only to be mocked and denied service by a smug waiter. The wealthy guests laugh, the staff looks away, until a deep voice cuts through the room. The entire restaurant falls silent. Shaquille Turner steps forward. And in minutes, the waiter's arrogance crumbles. The rich diners lower their heads, and the power shifts in a way no one saw coming. Watch till the end, because this is a lesson they'll never forget. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The heavy glass doors of La Maison Brevant, an upscale restaurant known for catering to the city's elite, swung open as Sarah Dawson stepped inside with her two children, Liam and Olivia. The warm glow of golden chandeliers bathed the dining hall in a soft, elegant light. Crystal clear wine glasses lined the tables, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive steaks, truffle risottos, and aged red wine. Laughter and quiet conversations filled the space, but as soon as Sarah and her kids stepped inside, an unspoken shift in energy rippled through the room. Sarah, in her early 30s, carried herself with quiet dignity, though the exhaustion in her eyes was impossible to miss. Her long brown hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, her jeans slightly faded, and her light blue sweater, while clean, had seen better days. She held Olivia's small hand, while Liam, just 10 years old but already protective of his mother, walked beside her with cautious steps. They weren't dressed like the restaurant's usual patrons, but they weren't there to impress anyone. They were just looking for a warm meal, a rare treat Sarah had saved up for. At first, no one paid them much attention. The waiters continued their work, serving wine to businessmen in tailored suits and carrying plates of seared salmon to women draped in expensive designer dresses. But then Bryce, the senior waiter, spotted them. Standing near the host's podium, Bryce had perfected the art of silent judgment. Tall, lean, and always dressed in an impeccably pressed uniform, he carried himself with the smug arrogance of someone who believed their position gave them authority over others. His dark eyes scanned Sarah and her children with thinly veiled disdain. He took in their modest clothing, the hesitant way they stepped inside as if they already anticipated rejection, and the hopeful way Sarah looked toward the empty tables near the corner. His lip curled in amusement. "Can I help you?" His voice dripped with condescension as he stepped toward them, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. He didn't bother masking his bored, uninterested tone. Sarah, ignoring the slight edge in his voice, gave a polite smile. "Yes, a table for 3, please." Bryce didn't move. Instead, he let his gaze travel over them once more, his smirk growing. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice just loud enough that the nearby diners could hear. A few heads turned, a couple in the corner whispering to each other. Liam shifted uneasily beside his mother, already picking up on the tension. Sarah straightened her shoulders. "Yes," she said firmly. "A table for 3. Bryce let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head as if he had just heard something amusing. "I'm afraid we have a very strict reservation policy," he said. "And we're fully booked tonight." Sarah's smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly composed herself. She knew what this was. She had seen that look before, the way certain people like Bryce scanned her up and down, as if deciding whether she deserved to be in certain places. She glanced past him. Several empty tables were clearly visible, freshly cleaned and waiting for guests. "We don't have a reservation, but we'd be happy to wait," she said. "I can see there are tables available." Bryce let out a dramatic sigh, rubbing his chin as if he were considering her request, though the answer was already clear. "Those tables are reserved for our regular clientele." He gestured subtly to the well-dressed patrons around the room. "We have a very high standard here. You understand?" Liam clenched his fists at his sides, his small face burning with frustration. He looked up at his mother, waiting for her to fight back, to tell Bryce off for treating them this way. But Sarah knew better. She had fought these battles before, and they never ended well. Still, she refused to let her kids see her crumble. "We can pay," she said, keeping her voice even. "I've saved up for this." Bryce arched an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh? And how will you be paying?" His tone carried an unmistakable implication. Sarah pulled out her wallet, her hand steady despite the way her heart pounded in her chest. She had just enough saved for tonight. enough to let her kids enjoy one nice meal without worrying about bills or the struggles waiting for them at home. But Bryce wasn't interested in logic or fairness. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice mocking, dismissive. "This restaurant has a dress code. We can't just let anyone in." Olivia, only 7, looked up at her mother, confusion flickering in her big blue eyes. She didn't understand why the man wouldn't let them eat. Liam, however, understood perfectly. His small fists tightened, his jaw clenching. A soft laugh drifted from a table nearby. A middle-aged man in a sharp black suit smirked as he sipped his wine. Across the room, a blonde woman wearing a diamond necklace whispered something to her friend, both of them glancing towards Sarah with amusement. Sarah felt her stomach twist, the weight of the humiliation setting in. Every part of her wanted to grab her children and walk out with her dignity intact. But then, a voice, deep, strong, unshakable. "Is there a problem here?" The room fell into silence. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks froze inches from mouths. The energy in the restaurant shifted instantly. Sarah turned, as did Bryce, and every other curious onlooker. Standing just a few feet away was a towering man, broad-shouldered and commanding. He was dressed in a sleek black designer suit, an expensive watch gleaming against his dark skin. His posture was relaxed, but there was something about him that made everyone pay attention. Shaquille Turner, known by many as Big Shaq. The moment Bryce recognized him, his entire demeanor changed. But it was too late. The weight of the moment hung in the air like an axe waiting to fall. And this time, Sarah wasn't the one who had to fight. Sarah Dawson stood frozen, her fingers gripping Olivia's small hand tightly, trying to ignore the burning heat of embarrassment spreading through her chest. The atmosphere inside La Maison Brevant had turned suffocating, not because of the luxurious chandeliers overhead or the rich aroma of expensive steaks, but because of the dozens of eyes now watching her, judging her, silently dismissing her. Bryce, standing smugly behind the podium, let out an exaggerated sigh and folded his arms, staring at Sarah like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. "As I said, ma'am, we're fully booked tonight." His voice carried easily across the restaurant, ensuring that nearby guests caught every word. A few of them exchanged amused glances, their lips curling into knowing smirks. Sarah inhaled sharply, forcing herself to remain calm. "I understand," she said, keeping her voice steady, controlled. "But I can see empty tables. We won't take long. My kids are hungry and I—" Bryce let out a mocking chuckle, shaking his head as if this was the funniest thing he had heard all day. "You see empty tables?" he repeated, his tone dripping with condescension. "Those are reserved for paying customers." A stifled laugh came from a table near the bar. A middle-aged man in a charcoal gray suit smirked, raising his wine glass as if toasting Bryce's comment. Across the room, a group of women, adorned in diamond jewelry and designer dresses, whispered amongst themselves, throwing discreet yet obvious glances in Sarah's direction. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Her eyes flicked toward her children. Olivia clung to her side, confusion filling her innocent face. Liam, however, stood rigid, his small fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. "We can pay," Sarah said again, firmer this time. "I have money. Just bring us the menu." Bryce's smirk widened as he tilted his head toward the bar, making a show of addressing the other guests. "You hear that? She says she can pay." A few chuckles rippled through the room, quiet but sharp, like daggers meant to cut just deep enough. Sarah swallowed against the burning knot of humiliation in her throat. She had known this wouldn't be easy. She had spent her life navigating places where people like Bryce decided who belonged and who didn't. But she wasn't about to let her children go hungry just because of one arrogant waiter with a superiority complex. She met Bryce's gaze directly, refusing to look away. "Just take our order," she said evenly. But Bryce wasn't finished. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, straightening his posture, making it clear that this conversation was over. His lips curved into a lazy smirk as he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Some people don't know their place." The restaurant fell into silence. Sarah felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. but she refused to let the moisture gathering in her eyes fall. Not here. Not in front of these people. Not in front of her children. Liam's chest rose and fell with shallow, angry breaths. He didn't understand everything about the world yet, but he understood injustice. He understood the way Bryce's words had been aimed at his mother, at his sister, at him. Bryce turned slightly, motioning toward the door. "I suggest you leave," he said smoothly. "There's a diner down the street. Maybe they can—" Then, a voice cut through the air. Deep, powerful, unshakable. "Is there a problem here?" It wasn't loud. It wasn't rushed. But it commanded the entire room. Every conversation, every laugh, every whispered remark died instantly. Sarah turned, and so did Bryce. Standing a few feet away, watching the scene unfold, was Shaquille Turner. The moment Bryce recognized him, his entire demeanor changed, but the damage had already been done. And now, he was about to pay the price. The air in La Maison Brevant grew unbearably still, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. The quiet hum of conversation had vanished, replaced by a suffocating silence that gripped every guest, every waiter, every pair of eyes that had been watching Sarah and her children with amusement just moments ago. The restaurant, so used to its polished world of wealth and exclusivity, now felt like a stage where something far more important than fine dining was about to unfold. And at the center of it all stood Shaquille, Big Shaq Turner. He stepped forward from the VIP section with the kind of presence that shifted the energy in a room without a single word. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded an aura of quiet authority. His black tailored suit fit him perfectly, his gold watch catching the light as he moved. Every detail about him, from the way he carried himself to the calm confidence in his sharp gaze, made it immediately clear that he was someone important. Someone powerful. Bryce, still standing smugly behind the podium, felt it first. The creeping awareness that something had changed. That the control he had just moments ago, when he had mocked Sarah and her kids, when the wealthy guests had laughed along, was slipping through his fingers. Before Bryce could react, Shaq placed a firm but measured hand on his shoulder. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't forceful, but the weight of it alone made Bryce stiffen. "Is there a problem here?" Shaq's voice was deep, steady, and carried across the restaurant like a command. He didn't raise it, didn't need to. It demanded attention all the same. Every pair of eyes darted toward the scene. The guests, who had been enjoying the spectacle moments ago, now looked on with uncertainty. The servers by the bar stopped mid-pour. Even the maitre d', who had been watching everything unfold from a distance, suddenly seemed unsure of whether to intervene or stay silent. Bryce swallowed hard. The confidence, the smug amusement that had laced his words just seconds earlier? Gone. His jaw clenched, his hands instinctively tightening into nervous fists at his sides. Bryce stammered, licking his lips, searching for the words that might save him. "I was just—" Shaq didn't even glance at him. Instead, he turned his full attention to the children. With the kind of patience and care that felt almost unnatural in a place like this, Shaq crouched down to Liam and Olivia's level, his towering presence shifting into something protective, reassuring. The tension that had been sitting like a weight on Liam's small shoulders seemed to ease just slightly. Olivia, still clinging to her mother's side, blinked up at him, wide-eyed, confused. Shaq offered them a warm, genuine smile. "You two hungry?" Liam hesitated. He darted a glance at his mother before nodding cautiously. "Yes, sir," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Shaq's smile didn't falter. "What do you like to eat?" Olivia, still too shy to speak, squeezed Sarah's hand, but Liam was braver now. He squared his shoulders, finding a little bit of courage in the presence of this man who, for some reason, felt safe. "Burgers," Liam answered, then quickly added, "But my mom likes pasta." Shaq nodded like that was the most important thing he had heard all day. He turned to Sarah next, his expression softening. Sarah was still in shock. She knew who this man was. Shaquille Turner, entrepreneur, philanthropist, one of the wealthiest investors in the city. A man who didn't just own businesses, he built them. His name had been on the cover of Forbes more than once. He had been interviewed about his rise from nothing to one of the most powerful men in the industry. And now, he was kneeling in front of her children, acting as if they were the only people in this entire restaurant who mattered. Her throat tightened. She had spent so long fighting battles on her own, trying to shield her kids from the worst parts of the world, and now, someone else was standing up for them. Before she could say anything, Shaq stood up again, slowly, deliberately. His gaze shifted back to Bryce, and this time there was no warmth left in his expression. Bryce felt it. He knew, without a doubt, that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Bryce let out a forced, shaky laugh, the arrogance in his face fading as reality came crashing down around him. The weight of Shaquille Turner's gaze was like a vice tightening around his chest. His smirk faltered, his fingers twitched slightly, and for the first time all night, he looked genuinely uncertain. This is all just a misunderstanding, Bryce stammered, his voice nowhere near as confident as before. I wasn't refusing service, I was just... He paused, trying to string together a lie that would make sense, that would save him. But nothing came. Shaq didn't blink. He didn't move. He simply stood there, his broad shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. His silence was worse than anger, worse than yelling. It was a mirror, one that forced Bryce to see himself exactly as he was. Sarah could feel the tension in the room shift. Moments ago, the guests who had been entertained by Bryce's mockery were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A few reached for their wine glasses, sipping carefully, as if suddenly wishing they could disappear into the furniture. The same people who had laughed were now avoiding eye contact, embarrassed. Shaq took a slow step forward. The movement wasn't aggressive, but it commanded attention. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, calm, but piercing. Would you have treated them the same if they looked different? The words landed like a hammer. A few gasps whispered through the room. A couple at the corner table froze mid-bite. Even the waitstaff, who had been lingering by the kitchen entrance, looked at each other with wide eyes, knowing there was no coming back from that question. Bryce's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth was already out in the open, and everyone in that restaurant knew it. Just then, a man in a charcoal gray suit came rushing out from the back of the restaurant, his forehead glistening with sweat. Richard Langley, the owner of La Maison Brevant, a man who prided himself on maintaining an image of exclusivity, sophistication, and luxury. And right now, his carefully curated reputation was hanging by a thread. He recognized Shaq immediately. "Mr. Turner," Langley practically gasped, his voice breathless with panic. I wasn't aware you were here tonight, sir. Please allow me to personally..." Shaq didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes locked on Bryce, waiting for an answer. Bryce's lips parted, his face pale. His voice cracked, his jaw clenched, but he had nothing to say, because they all knew the answer. And now, the whole world was watching. A thick silence hung over La Maison Brevant, heavy and suffocating, as if the very walls of the restaurant felt the weight of what had just happened. Every guest, every waiter, every passing glance that had once judged Sarah and her children now bore a different expression. Uncertainty, discomfort, even regret. But none of it mattered anymore, because now Shaquille Turner was in control. With deliberate ease, Shaq reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek black card, the kind that didn't have spending limits, the kind that spoke volumes without needing an introduction. He held it between his fingers, inspecting it for a second, before turning toward Sarah and her kids. "Dinner's on me," he said smoothly, his voice calm, steady. "Order whatever you want, the most expensive meal on the menu." Sarah's eyes widened, a mixture of gratitude and shock flashing across her face. She opened her mouth to protest, but Shaq shook his head once, a subtle yet firm gesture that said there was no argument to be made. Across the room, Richard Langley, the restaurant's owner, nodded so quickly his necktie shifted. "Absolutely, Mr. Turner, right away." His voice dripped with eagerness, the desperation to salvage his restaurant's reputation painted across his face. Within seconds, the kitchen erupted into a frenzy. Chefs scrambled to plate the finest dishes, sous chefs barked out orders, and the waitstaff, suddenly hyper-aware of their every movement, began preparing a table with an urgency that hadn't existed minutes ago. But Shaq wasn't finished. His attention shifted back to Bryce. The once smug and untouchable waiter now stood frozen, his face drained of color. His hands, which had so confidently gestured toward the door when trying to kick Sarah out, now twitched slightly at his sides. He could feel it coming. The reckoning. Shaq took a slow step forward, closing the space between them just enough to make Bryce instinctively lean back. His voice was lower this time, steady and deliberate. "The problem," Shaq said, his gaze sharp, unwavering, "isn't just you, Bryce. The problem is people like you. People who think they can do this to others and never face consequences." The words landed like a crushing weight, stripping Bryce of whatever defense he had left. He knew it. Shaq knew it. Everyone in that restaurant knew it. Langley cleared his throat loudly, as if trying to signal something without speaking. But the pause stretched on too long, and Shaq's presence filled every inch of the silence. Finally, Langley swallowed and turned stiffly toward Bryce. His voice, though quiet, left no room for debate. "You're done here," he said simply. Bryce's breath hitched. "Sir, wait, you're fired." Langley didn't even let him finish. Bryce's entire body locked up. For the first time, he was on the receiving end of dismissal, of being cast out. The same humiliation he had inflicted on Sarah and her kids was now his to carry. Shaq didn't react, didn't gloat, didn't smile. He simply took one last glance at Bryce, then turned toward Sarah and motioned toward the lavish, freshly set table waiting for them. "Enjoy your meal," he said, his job here complete. And with that, the power in the room had officially shifted. Sarah sat at the elegantly set table, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the crisp white napkin in front of her. The soft clinking of fine china and polished silverware echoed faintly in the background. Yet all she could hear was the rapid beating of her own heart. She blinked quickly, willing away the tears that threatened to spill. It wasn't just the generosity of Shaquille Turner that overwhelmed her. It was the unexpected kindness in a place where she had only expected cruelty. Liam sat beside her, his small hands resting on the table, eyes still wide as he looked up at Shaq, with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The anger that had burned inside him earlier, the helplessness of watching his mother be humiliated, had now shifted into something new. Hope. He had never seen someone like Shaq before. A man who didn't just have power, but used it to stand up for others. Shaq, now seated across from them, leaned back slightly in his chair, his broad frame relaxed, yet commanding. He glanced at Liam and Olivia, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "So burgers, huh?" he said, tapping the side of the table lightly. "Good choice. But I gotta say, the steak here? Pretty legendary. Might change your life." Olivia giggled softly, still shy but no longer afraid. Liam, eager to impress, squared his shoulders and nodded. "I'll try the steak," he declared, his voice carrying more confidence than it had all night. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "That's what I like to hear." Around them, the atmosphere of the restaurant had shifted entirely. The same guests who had smirked and whispered earlier now avoided looking in their direction, their faces stiff with the quiet realization that they had been complicit in something ugly. Some of them stirred uncomfortably in their seats, their meals no longer as appetizing as before. The illusion of exclusivity had cracked, revealing the truth beneath it. That respect, real respect, had nothing to do with money, status, or expensive suits. The restaurant staff, once indifferent, now moved with deliberate care. The waiters who had ignored Sarah's presence before were suddenly attentive, polite, even nervous. The maitre d' personally delivered the appetizers, offering a tight professional smile, though the discomfort in his eyes was clear. Sarah inhaled deeply, composing herself as she looked across the table at Shaq. She didn't know what to say, how to properly thank him. But when their eyes met, he gave a small nod, as if he already understood. "This shouldn't have happened," Shaq said, his voice quieter now, meant only for her. "But I wanted your kids to see that it doesn't have to be this way." Sarah swallowed hard and nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around her napkin. For the first time in a long time, she believed it. The soft murmur of conversation had returned to La Maison Brevant, but it wasn't the same as before. There was no laughter at another person's expense, no smug whispers exchanged between the wealthy patrons. Instead, there was a quiet, uneasy respect that filled the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that something significant had just taken place. At the center of it all, Shaquille Turner remained unfazed. He had done what he came to do, not to create a scene, not to seek revenge, but to set a standard. A reminder that wealth doesn't define worth, and power isn't about status. It's about what you do with it. As he reached for the check, the waiter hesitated before handing it over, his hands visibly trembling. But Shaq didn't even look at the total. Instead, he pulled a sleek pen from his inside pocket and, with effortless precision, signed the bill. Then beneath his signature, he wrote a note. "Your worth isn't measured by money. Keep your head up." He folded the receipt neatly and slid it across the table toward Sarah. Her breath hitched slightly as she read the words, her fingers tracing over the ink as if trying to commit them to memory. She knew this night had changed her, but more importantly, it had changed her children. Shaq then reached into his wallet and placed a thick stack of crisp $100 bills on the table, far more than the bill itself required. The kind of tip that would have made any restaurant owner beam with pride. But this wasn't for the establishment. This was a message. A message that respect should never be optional. As he stood, the entire restaurant watched, but this time, there was no amusement in their eyes, no curiosity, just a deep, silent respect. Bryce, still frozen near the podium, his once pristine uniform now a symbol of his downfall, could only stare as Shaq passed him. His throat bobbed as if he wanted to say something, an apology, an excuse, anything that might undo what had just happened. But nothing came out. Because what could he say? The weight of his actions sat heavy on his chest, crushing down with a force he had never expected to feel. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that his judgment went unchecked. But tonight, he learned the truth, and it had cost him everything. Sarah stood next, her back a little straighter than before. She reached for her children's hands, holding them tightly, not out of fear, but out of quiet strength. Liam looked up at Shaq, admiration shining in his young eyes. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice firm, steady, a boy who had learned what real strength looked like. Shaq simply gave him a nod, the corner of his lips lifting in the faintest hint of approval. And then, without another word, he walked toward the exit, pushing open the heavy glass doors. As he stepped outside, the night air cool against his skin, he didn't bother looking back. He didn't need to, because he already knew. They would never forget this moment. Inside, the camera lingers on the table where Sarah and her kids now sat, not as outsiders, not as charity, but as people who belonged. The frame slowly fades to black. Then, in bold white letters, the final message appears on the screen. Respect is free. But disrespect? That comes at a cost. They thought they could mock her, dismiss her, humiliate her. But in just minutes, the entire restaurant learned a lesson they'll never forget. Shaquille Turner didn't just stand up for Sarah. He changed the rules. He proved that real power isn't in wealth or status, but in how you treat others. If you believe respect should never be a privilege, but a right, like, share, and subscribe. More powerful stories are coming, and you won't want to miss what happens next.